400 of America's most elite warriors, Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, Delta operators, were bleeding out inside a stone canyon with no air support, no escape route, and an enemy sniper picking them apart one by one. Command had no solution. The rescue window was closing, and the only person on that entire forward operating base who knew exactly what to do was the woman they'd been laughing at all week. The cook. The woman who poured their coffee every morning. The woman whose name not one of them could remember. If you're new here, follow this channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, stay with me, because this one will change the way you look at every quiet person who's ever been invisible in the room. The alarm at FOB Black Mesa didn't ring at 04:30. It never did. What woke the base was the smell. Burned coffee, scorched bacon grease, and the faint chemical bite of industrial cleaning fluid. That was the olfactory alarm clock for 400 of the most highly trained warfighters on the American continent. Before the sun cracked the ridgeline, before the intel officers finished their morning briefs, before squad leaders had their boots fully laced, the dining facility was already alive with heat and noise and the kind of exhausted, low-volume profanity that only existed between soldiers before their first caffeine hit. Emma Brooks had been awake for 2 hours already. She stood behind the serving counter in a faded olive-drab apron, her hair pulled back in a tight knot, her eyes fixed on the steam tray she was repositioning for the third time. The eggs weren't level. It bothered her in a way she couldn't fully articulate. Not the eggs themselves, but the instinct underneath the irritation. The old reflex of making sure everything was precisely where it needed to be before the situation changed. Old habits. She'd been at Black Mesa for 4 months, long enough that the operators had stopped noticing her entirely, which was, by design, exactly what she needed. Brooks. The voice came from behind her. Sergeant First Class Denny Okafor, the senior NCO for dining operations. A compact man in his late 40s with a neck like a fire hydrant and the conversational warmth of a tax audit. He leaned against the far wall with a clipboard and an expression that suggested the morning had already disappointed him. "You short on the hash browns again?" "I'm not short. I redistributed the portion size." "The Rangers are going to riot." "The Rangers eat too fast to notice." Okafor stared at her. She stared at the steam tray. Neither of them moved for a moment. "Just make sure the coffee doesn't run out before 7, he said, and walked away. Emma exhaled slowly and returned to work. The first wave of operators filed in at 04:45. The early risers, the ones who'd been up since 3 doing physical training in the dark because they were incapable of existing without structured suffering. They were Rangers mostly, lean and sun-darkened, carrying trays with the practiced efficiency of people who ate for fuel rather than pleasure. They sat in clusters, voices low, heads bent over phones or maps or nothing at all. The particular silence of men who spent enough time in loud places that quiet had become something they guarded. None of them looked at Emma. She had understood from the first week that she was, to them, roughly equivalent to a piece of furniture. Not disrespectfully so. It wasn't malice. It was simply the way people looked through anyone whose function was considered transactional. She handed them food. They received it. The exchange required nothing from either party beyond mechanical competence, which was fine. It was better than fine. It was the whole point. She moved along the line, refilling trays, and while she moved, she watched. Not obviously. Never obviously. It was the kind of watching that didn't look like watching, the kind that registered data without advertising the collection. The operator near the window with the slight favoring of his left leg. The squad leader 2 tables back whose jaw was clenched in a way that had nothing to do with the food. The cluster of SEALs near the back exit who were speaking in the clipped, abbreviated shorthand of a pre-mission brief poorly disguised as casual conversation. Something was moving. She'd felt it the night before, lying awake in her quarters, listening to the wind change direction twice in an hour. Felt it that morning when she stepped outside at 400 and stood in the cold dark long enough to register what the weather was doing across the ridge to the northwest. The barometric pressure had been dropping since midnight. Not dramatically, not the kind of drop that triggered official weather holds, but enough. Enough for someone who knew how to read terrain and atmosphere the way most people read text messages. She'd said nothing. It wasn't her place to say anything. That was the whole brutal architecture of deep cover. You constructed your silence the way an engineer constructs a load-bearing wall, and you did not remove it simply because you were worried. By 0600, the dining facility was at full capacity. The noise level had climbed to something approaching a moderate argument, and the smell of coffee had finally overpowered the cleaning fluid. Emma worked the line mechanically, refilling, redistributing, checking temperatures, doing the 100 invisible tasks that kept the operation running and kept her exactly where she needed to be, present, unnoticed, and watching everything. That was when Captain Harlan Voss walked in. She knew who he was. She'd known since his first day on base because she'd made it her business to know every officer above the rank of 03 within 48 hours of their arrival. Voss was 75th Ranger Regiment, mission commander for Operation Iron Falcon, and he walked like a man who'd been told he was excellent so many times it had become a physical characteristic. He was 34, square-jawed, with the specific brand of confidence that sometimes looked like competence until you saw it under pressure. He moved through the chow line without looking at the food, which meant his mind was already somewhere else. "Extra protein, less starch," he said to Emma without making eye contact. She adjusted his tray. "You know what the weather's going to do today?" he said, still not looking at her, speaking the way people sometimes spoke to service workers, not quite expecting an answer, filling silence out of some vague social obligation. Emma glanced at the ridgeline visible through the far window. The sky had gone from black to a deep, bruised gray-purple, the kind of pre-dawn color that looked dramatic in photographs and told experienced outdoorsmen to pay attention. "Winds shifting northwest to southwest," she said. "Pressure's been dropping since midnight. You'll likely have reduced visibility in the canyon systems by mid-morning, sand particulate if it accelerates." Voss finally looked at her. It was the look she recognized, the momentary recalibration when someone expected a vending machine to answer and got a weather forecast instead. He stared at her for just a second too long, then took his tray. "Thanks," he said, and his voice had shifted slightly, the way voices shifted when people weren't quite sure what register to use. He walked away. Emma watched the ridge. She'd first arrived at Black Mesa under a cover identity so thoroughly constructed it had taken the better part of a year to build. The paperwork was immaculate. Contractor employment history, food service certifications, a background check that turned up nothing alarming because the people who built her legend had made sure of it. She was listed as a civilian contractor employee of a support services company that did logistics work for several forward operating bases across the theater. What the paperwork didn't say, Emma Brooks, not her real name, though she'd stopped thinking in terms of real names a long time ago, had spent 11 years in a unit that officially didn't exist. A small element buried inside the intelligence community's most classified tier, staffed by people who had been identified early in their military careers as possessing a specific combination of attributes: exceptional tactical aptitude, unusual calm under extreme stress, and the rare capacity for sustained long-term cover operations. The unit had no official designation in any budget document that anyone without a very specific clearance level would ever see. Its operators were inserted into environments where conventional special operations couldn't go, under identities that had to survive sustained scrutiny from adversaries with significant counterintelligence capabilities. She'd been good at it. Better than good. For 9 years, she'd moved through 3 different countries under 3 different identities and had produced intelligence that had directly enabled a dozen high-value target operations. And then, 18 months ago, the mission had gone wrong in the way only the worst kinds of missions went wrong. Not through enemy action, not through bad planning, but through a leak somewhere inside the network she'd trusted. Her cover had been flagged, not blown, not confirmed, but flagged, which in that world was enough to trigger a controlled extraction and a mandatory stand-down period. The stand-down had eventually become an assignment to Black Mesa. Observation and assessment, her handler had called it during the debrief. Low-exposure environment, standard cover. You watch, you report any anomalies, you stay invisible. What they hadn't said, but what she understood anyway, was that this was also a test of whether 18 months of operational stress had left her fit for return to active work, or whether she was going to need a different conversation about her future. She was 37 years old. She'd spent more than a third of her life disappearing into roles that other people couldn't have sustained for a month. She knew how to be invisible. She just hadn't planned on being this invisible. The first indication that something was wrong, genuinely wrong, not the background hum of operational tension that existed at every forward base, came at 00714. Emma was in the back kitchen, breaking down the breakfast service, when the sound of boots accelerating told her that someone was moving with purpose through the dining facility. Not the casual jog of a soldier late for a formation. This was the sound of multiple people moving fast toward the operations center, and underneath it, just barely audible through the insulated walls, the warble of a radio signal being boosted. She set down the tray she was holding. Through the serving window, she could see the main floor of the dining facility, now half empty as the morning rush thinned out. Two rangers near the window had both looked up from their food at the same moment, heads turning toward the operations center like compass needles responding to a magnetic shift. One of them said something to the other and stood up. Whatever it was, it had just changed the rhythm of the base. Emma dried her hands on a dish towel and walked to the window at the far end of the kitchen, the one that nobody used because it faced away from the main compound toward the eastern ridge. She'd positioned herself near that window enough times that Okafor had stopped asking her what she was looking at. The view wasn't interesting to anyone who wasn't reading it. She read it now. The canyon systems to the east, the deep folded terrain that the local geography had carved over 10,000 years into something that looked, from altitude, like the inside of a broken shell, were still in pre-dawn shadow. But the light was changing in a way that wasn't natural. At the far end of the southern canyon approach, approximately 4 kilometers out, there was a quality to the dust that didn't match the wind she could feel at her location. Ground vehicles, multiple, moving in from the south. She stood very still for approximately 5 seconds. Then she walked out of the kitchen, through the back corridor and out the rear exit of the dining facility into the cold morning air. The operations center was 130 meters to her northeast. Through its exterior walls, she could hear the sound that she'd been afraid of since she'd checked the weather at 0400, and felt the particular dread that came with knowing something was building toward a bad outcome. Voices. Overlapping. Someone calling for a fire mission. And underneath all of it, barely audible, the mechanical stutter of heavy weapons fire. Distant but unmistakably real, rolling off the canyon walls and arriving at the base like a rumor of something catastrophic. She turned and walked back inside. By 7:30, the information available at FOB Black Mesa had cohered into something that was, depending on your threshold, either a very bad situation or an absolute disaster. Emma pieced it together from fragments. What she overheard near the operations center, what she read in the faces of the radio operators she could see through the window, what she extrapolated from the timing and the sounds still drifting in from the east. She was not read into Operation Iron Falcon's execution details. She hadn't needed to be. She'd seen enough of the planning tempo over the past 2 weeks to understand the broad architecture. A pre-dawn movement through Red Fang Pass to intercept a high-value target associated with a sophisticated IED network, executed by a combined force of Rangers, SEALs, and Special Operations Support personnel. 400 personnel total. Heavy vehicle assets. Air on call. Air on call. She looked at the sky. The weather she'd registered at 0400 had continued to develop exactly as she'd feared. The pressure drop had accelerated. The wind shift she'd noted was now visible in the behavior of the dust across the compound. Not the steady directional movement of normal desert wind, but the circular, irregular churn that preceded a sandstorm system. Not a catastrophic one. Not a 2-day event that buried everything. The kind that reduced visibility to under a kilometer and grounded anything without instrument flight capability, which, in this theater, at this altitude, in these canyon approaches, meant everything. No helicopters, no close air support, no medevac. She walked back to the kitchen, put on a fresh pot of coffee, and stood with her hands flat on the counter and her eyes on the wall and worked through what she knew. 400 operators in Red Fang Pass, which was a canyon system with 2 viable ground exits, both of which could be controlled by a force with adequate elevated positions. Enemy intelligence and the IED network's associated command structure had demonstrated, repeatedly, that they possessed very good intelligence, would have known about Iron Falcon. How long they'd known was the question that would haunt the post-mission debrief, assuming there was one. Long enough to pre-position forces on the ridgelines. Long enough to set the kill zone. long enough to plan for the weather, or at least to be willing to execute in it. A horseshoe ambush. She'd seen the template before, in a different country, in a different desert, executed against a different force that had also believed it was going in against a static target. The sound of weapons fire from the east had not stopped. Emma looked at the coffee, which was almost done brewing, and thought about what she was going to do next. She thought about it very carefully, with the same methodical structure she applied to every problem that had more than one wrong answer and only one right one. Then she looked at the clock. 7:41. "Denny?" she called. Okafor appeared from the storage corridor with a look of generalized irritation. "What?" "I need you to cover the line for a while." He looked at her. "Where are you going?" "I'll be back." "Brooks." His voice dropped. "What's going on out there? I'm hearing—" "I'll be back," she said again, and this time her voice had a quality that stopped him in a way that Okafor's expression suggested he didn't fully understand but responded to anyway. She walked out. Her quarters were a 12 by 12 room in the contractor housing block, separated from the main barracks, near enough to the perimeter fence that the night wind came through the gaps in the exterior wall every time the temperature dropped. She'd requested that room specifically. 3 different people had told her it was the worst one in the block. She'd smiled and said she slept hot. The floor was plywood over concrete. Under the plywood, in the eastern corner nearest the wall, there was a space approximately 14 inches deep and 60 inches long that didn't exist on the building's structural drawings, because Emma had modified those drawings herself during the 3rd week after her arrival. She knelt down, pressed 2 fingers against the plywood seam, and lifted. She'd assembled everything in segments over 4 months, using the kind of patient, unhurried process that was the only way to do this kind of thing without creating a signature. Individual components, arriving through different channels, stored separately until they were needed. The rifle itself was a custom long-range precision system, not the standard SOCOM configurations, not anything that came from a normal supply chain. It was built around a .338 Lapua Magnum action, with a chassis system that broke down into components small enough to carry in a kitchen supply box, and a suppressor that reduced the auditory signature enough to make the source identification difficult at range. She assembled it in 6 minutes. The equipment around it, the advanced ballistic computation system, the environmental sensors, the combat kit she'd maintained on a monthly maintenance schedule against the possibility that she would never need to open it, came out of the space with the same organized efficiency. She dressed quickly, shedding the kitchen contractor's clothing and pulling on the stripped-down tactical kit she'd maintained at a weight that accommodated sustained movement in high-altitude terrain. She looked at herself for exactly 1 second in the small mirror on the wall. Then she picked up the rifle case, slung her kit, and went back out. Ping! The cliff face behind FOB Black Mesa rose approximately 900 feet above the base elevation and was, by any conventional assessment, unclimbable without equipment. Emma had spent 6 weekends over 4 months mapping an alternate route, not the technical climber's definition of alternate, which involved ropes and hardware, but the specific, ugly, 3-point contact scramble that required knowing exactly which holds would bear weight and exactly which looked solid but weren't. She'd timed herself twice, both times between 68 and 72 minutes. She began climbing at 7:48. The wind at the cliff face was worse than it had been in the compound. It came in gusts rather than steady flow, which was manageable if you paused during the strong pulses and moved in the brief windows between them. Her arm strength held. Her boots found the holds she'd memorized. The rifle case, secured across her back, added weight and shifted her center of gravity in ways she compensated for automatically, the way a musician compensated for an unfamiliar instrument by listening more carefully. Halfway up, she stopped on a ledge approximately 8 feet wide and looked out over the desert. Below and to the east, the canyon systems were now illuminated by the risen sun, and what she could see from this elevation was a battle. Not the clean, organized kind that got described in after-action reports. The real kind. Smoke columns from burning vehicles, the tiny distant sparks of muzzle flash along the ridgelines, the specific movement patterns of a force under fire trying to find angles of cover that didn't exist. The enemy positions on the high ground were excellent. Whoever had planned this had planned it with care and time, and the horseshoe geometry was exactly what she'd feared. Pressure from both ridges, an exit blocked by vehicle wreckage, and a long-range precision shooter somewhere on the northern cliff face who was methodically removing anyone who tried to move toward the eastern egress. She registered all of this the way she registered everything, completely and without a visible reaction. Then she kept climbing. She reached the summit at 0901. The peak was a rough plateau, approximately 30 meters across at its widest, broken by windswept rock formations that provided natural cover positions at the southern edge. From the southern lip, the view into Red Fang Pass opened up with the kind of brutal clarity that only extreme elevation and clear air produced. The canyon floor, the burning vehicles, the ridgeline positions, the flow of the firefight laid out below her like a terrible map. She set up in 3 minutes. Prone position, behind a rock formation that gave her a front-facing silhouette consistent with the natural terrain, the rifle deployed on its bipod, the ballistic computer online, the environmental sensor suite reading wind speed, direction, temperature, and atmospheric density at her position, and through the modeling algorithm at the target range. She ranged the canyon floor first, 1,400 meters to the nearest position, 1,800 to the enemy's main ridge line. The sniper she was looking for, and she was certain there was one, based on the casualty pattern she'd observed from halfway up the cliff, would be farther out. The northern cliff face, the natural elevation for a position that could cover the eastern egress without being exposed to return fire from the canyon floor. She began working the scope. It took her 8 minutes to find him. He was good. The position was expertly chosen. A natural rock overhang that eliminated his back profile completely, shade that kept his optics from throwing a reflection, and a spotter tucked 6 feet to his left who was managing range cards and calling corrections. They'd been there long enough that their movements had settled into a rhythm, which was the thing that finally gave them away. The spotter's head moved on a predictable cycle, scanning, returning to the range card, scanning again. When Emma's scope reached the right sector on the 4th cycle, the pattern broke one time. A pause, a slight adjustment, and she held on that position until the sniper's suppressed barrel became visible as a straight geometric line against the irregular natural texture of the rock. She dialed the elevation, checked the wind call. The distance was 2,040 meters, beyond most practical field engagements. At this range, with this wind, the bullet would spend approximately 2.3 seconds in flight, during which the wind would push it laterally. The Earth's rotation would impose a small but real deflection, and any error in her environmental reading would compound into a miss measured in feet rather than inches. She breathed out slowly, relaxed her body in stages, starting with her shoulders, working down through her core, her hips, her legs, until she was as much a part of the rock as the rock itself. The scope picture was clear. Her finger rested against the trigger with the exact amount of pressure, not pressing, not holding back, simply resting, so that the break when it came would be a surprise to every muscle in her hand except the one that controlled it. She waited for the wind to settle between gusts. The window was 3 seconds. She took the shot in the middle of the second second. The recoil rolled through her shoulder. She stayed on the scope. 2,000 meters away, and 2.3 seconds later, the spotter on the northern cliff face turned to look at something that had just stopped moving. Emma was already adjusting for the next position. The effect on the battle below was not immediate. Nothing in a complex engagement changed instantaneously. The momentum of a firefight had mass. It took time to redirect, like trying to change the course of something moving very fast in a determined direction. But she could see the change beginning at the margins. The rate of accurate fire from the northern position dropped to 0, and without that overwatch suppression, the eastern egress, which had been a death corridor, lost its most important guardian. She worked the ridgeline positions methodically, not quickly, not hurrying, because hurrying at this range produced misses, and misses cost time she didn't have. She identified priority targets by their tactical function. The crew-served weapon teams first, because they produced the most damage per engagement, then the command elements she could identify by behavior, then the supporting positions as they became exposed. She fired 11 times in 40 minutes. 9 of those rounds found their targets. The 2 misses were real misses, not grazes, not wounded, actual misses. And she registered them without self-criticism and without dwelling on them. Because in the space of this kind of work, there was no room for anything except the next calculation. Below, the trapped force was beginning to move. She could see it. The slow initial movement that happened when a force realized the fire pressure that had been pinning them was changing in character, becoming less accurate, less continuous, opening small windows of opportunity that a good commander would exploit. She was watching this movement, watching the egress begin to open, when the sound behind her changed. Not a loud sound, a very quiet one. The specific sound of a boot finding purchase on rock. Emma did not move immediately. She stayed exactly where she was and let her peripheral awareness expand outward behind her, counting sound events, mapping movement, building a picture of what was coming up behind her without the option of turning to look. 3 individuals. Possibly 4. Moving with discipline, not rushing, not telegraphing, spreading their approach across the width of the plateau to prevent a single person from covering multiple angles simultaneously. Someone had known this position was occupied, or someone had thought to check it. She had 4 rounds remaining in the magazine. Her sidearm was on her right hip. The distance between her current position and the nearest incoming threat, based on the sound, was approximately 12 meters in closing. She did the math quickly. 4 rounds long-range rifle, 4 meters between her and the rock formation to her left. 1 pistol with 11 rounds, 4 enemies in a tactical approach, no supporting element, no communication with anyone below. The odds were not good. They rarely were. Emma completed the current shot because the target below was in the open and the mission came before her personal situation. Always. That was the rule she'd lived by for 11 years. And then she rolled left off the bipod and began moving. The first round came in from her right. It hit the rock where her head had been approximately a quarter of a second before she'd moved. The fight for the summit had begun. The rock fragment that exploded off the surface near her left knee drew blood before she'd fully registered the second shot. She didn't stop moving. Rolling left put her behind a boulder approximately the width of a kitchen table. Not ideal cover, not the position she would have chosen with time and options, but the position she had, and she'd fought from worse. She pressed her back against the rock and did a fast accounting of herself. Left knee bleeding, not deep, not structural. Right shoulder intact. Rifle in hand, 4 rounds chambered. Pistol on hip, undrawn. 4 enemies. Spread pattern, closing. The plateau was roughly 30 meters across and broken by natural rock formations, in a way that was excellent for defense if you had time to choose your ground, and catastrophic if you were being pushed toward the western edge, which dropped approximately 900 feet into the cliff face she'd just spent 70 minutes climbing. She had perhaps 6 seconds before the first of them reached a firing angle on her position. Emma did not waste any of them. She came up fast on the right side of the boulder, took a snapshot at the nearest movement, a figure in dark tactical gear crossing a gap between rock formations at 8 meters, and put the round center mass. He went down hard and didn't get back up. The sound of the suppressed shot was a sharp mechanical crack against the wind, and she was already moving again before the other 3 had fully registered where it had come from. 3 remaining. They adjusted immediately, which told her something she needed to know. These were not irregular fighters. The way they collapsed their spacing, the way 2 of them pushed left to flank while the 3rd held position and kept her suppressed with controlled, disciplined bursts. That was training, serious training. She'd seen that movement pattern in exactly 2 contexts in her career, and neither of them was a local militia. She filed the information away and kept moving. The suppressing fire from the 3rd man was accurate enough that she couldn't bring the rifle to bear without exposing herself past the margin of what was survivable. She drew the pistol instead, shifted to a crouch, and moved laterally along the cliffside rock line in the direction that put the most terrain between her and the flanking pair. The wind screamed across the plateau in a gust that lasted approximately 4 seconds. In those 4 seconds, ambient noise spiked enough to cover movement. Emma used all 4 of them. She came around the end of a rock spine and found one of the flankers at roughly 4 meters, mid-stride, not yet oriented to her new position. The pistol came up. 2 shots. He folded at the knees and his momentum carried him sideways into the rock before he went still. 2 remaining. But she'd exposed herself to do it, and the second flanker had seen her. The round caught her along the outside of her left arm. Not a hit, not quite, but close enough that she felt the concussive impact of displaced air and the burn of scorched fabric against skin. She threw herself behind a low rock shelf, belly down, and pressed her face against the stone while rounds snapped overhead with the specific frequency of someone who knew exactly where she was and was waiting for her to move. Pinned. She controlled her breathing, counted the cadence of the incoming fire. 4 rounds, pause, 4 rounds, pause. He was shooting in short, disciplined bursts and not wasting ammunition, which meant he was either very well trained or very experienced, and at this point the distinction didn't matter. The second man, the one still holding the original suppressing position, had gone quiet. That was worse. When a disciplined shooter went quiet, it meant he was moving. Emma rolled onto her back and looked up at the rock shelf above her. 2 feet of clearance. Not enough to stand, barely enough to crawl, and the surface above would be exposed to the sky in a way that... The shadow crossed her before the sound did. She reacted on pure reflex, bringing the pistol up and firing twice at the figure that had appeared at the edge of the shelf above her. 1 round went wide. The other connected somewhere in the upper body, not clean, not fatal, and the man, the fourth one, the one she'd thought was still holding the suppressing position, dropped off the shelf and landed beside her in the narrow space between the rocks with enough impact that the stone trembled. He was not out. Wounded, yes. Out, no. What followed in the next 45 seconds was the kind of fighting that never appeared in training manuals because it was too ugly and too variable to systematize. Close enough that technique became improvisation, close enough that the pistol became a liability because there wasn't room to extend it. Close enough that what determined the outcome was not skill in any classical sense, but the specific, brutal capacity to continue functioning while absorbing damage and to find leverage in a space that offered almost none. She took a hit across the left side of her ribs that drove the air out of her lungs. She used her elbow against the angle of his jaw. He got a hand around her wrist and she let the pistol go rather than fight the grip, used the freed hand to control his opposite elbow, and put all her remaining weight into a rotation that took them both into the rock face. His head made contact with the stone. The grip on her wrist went slack. Emma sat with her back against the rock and pulled air back into her lungs in long, deliberate pulls. The way she'd been taught when she was 23 years old, and someone considerably larger than her had demonstrated, with great conviction, that the panic response to oxygen deprivation was the most dangerous thing in a fight. She counted to 4 on the inhale. Held. Released. The second flanker, the one who'd been pinning her, had stopped firing. She picked up the pistol, checked it, and came up slowly to the edge of the rock shelf. The plateau was still. For one terrible moment she thought he'd gone to ground somewhere she couldn't see, that he was waiting, that this wasn't over. Then she heard it. Footsteps, moving away, moving fast toward the northern edge of the plateau, where the terrain dropped into a gully system that ran back down toward the ridgeline. He was running. She watched the direction for 3 seconds, confirmed he wasn't flanking, and made the calculation that pursuing a fleeing combatant in her current condition on this terrain, with the battle still active below, was not the decision that served the mission. She let him go. Then she went back to the rifle. Below, the battle had shifted in the time she'd been occupied with staying alive. The eastern egress, the exit from Red Fang Pass that the enemy sniper had been methodically closing, had partially opened, but only partially. The burning vehicle wreckage still blocked the primary lane, and the ridgeline positions she'd been engaging before the summit assault had partially recovered, with at least 2 crew-served weapon systems back in action at angles that covered the attempted breach. She could see the trapped force had tried to push during the window her earlier shots had created, and the leading vehicles had advanced perhaps 200 meters before the fire rebuilt enough to stop them again. 200 meters. Not enough. She inventoried what she had left. 2 rounds in the rifle, 9 rounds in the pistol. Left knee functional, but slow. Ribs on the left side either cracked or severely bruised. The difference was irrelevant at the moment because the treatment was identical and the treatment was nothing. Left arm stinging from the near miss, functional. She set up on the rifle and began identifying priority targets again. The first crew-served position on the southern ridgeline was operating from a sandbagged emplacement that had probably been constructed overnight. Too well integrated with the terrain to be improvised, which again told her something about the intelligence preparation that had gone into this ambush. The range was 1,400 meters. She calculated wind, adjusted elevation, and spent 30 seconds ensuring the picture was correct before pressing the trigger. The gun went silent. 1 round remaining. She ranged the second position, identified it, dialed in, and then held. Because one round left meant one decision, and she needed to make the right one. The second crew-served weapon was a problem, but it wasn't the critical problem. The critical problem was the vehicle wreckage in the eastern egress. Two burning APCs jackknifed across the road at an angle that prevented passage, but that could, conceivably, be breached if the right vehicle with the right approach angle hit them at sufficient speed with sufficient engine mass behind it, except that the road surface in front of the wreckage was being observed by a spotter on a low rock formation to the northeast, and that spotter was calling corrections to a mortar team she'd located behind the ridge but couldn't engage from her position. Every vehicle that had tried to move toward the wreckage in the last 40 minutes had been hit within 30 seconds of committing to the approach. Kill the spotter. Blind the mortar team. The vehicle with enough engine mass to breach the wreckage had a window. Maybe. She shifted the scope to the spotter's position. The range was 1,600 meters. She had one round. The wind was gusting at irregular intervals between 12 and 22 miles per hour from the northwest, with a cross component from the canyon thermal that complicated the lateral call. The target was partially obscured by the rock formation he was using as cover, with an exposed window of approximately 18 inches at the shoulder and head. Emma spent 45 seconds on the wind, not averaging it, reading it, learning its pattern, identifying the rhythm of the gusts, and finding the space between them that was consistently the calmest. There was a window, approximately 2 seconds, recurring every 17 to 20 seconds. She waited for the third cycle to confirm the pattern was stable. It was. She took the shot in the fourth window. The spotter's position went still. Below, after a pause of approximately 90 seconds, the mortar team recalibrating, trying to understand what had happened to their eyes. The next vehicle in the column began to move toward the wreckage. Emma watched it through the empty rifle scope, because she had no rounds left, and there was nothing else she could do from this position except witness what happened next. The vehicle hit the wreckage at speed. The sound arrived 2 seconds after the visual. A percussive crash that rolled up the canyon walls and bounced off the cliffs, followed by the secondary sound of the wreckage giving way, metal shrieking against metal, the geometry of the blockage collapsing under the impact. The passage was open, not wide, not clean, but open. And the force below began to move through it with the particular urgency of people who understood that the window might not last, and that every second of hesitation was a second the enemy had to respond. Emma lowered the rifle and sat back against the rock. Her ribs were sending increasingly specific complaints through the left side of her torso. Her knee had stiffened in the time she'd been prone and was not interested in the idea of movement. The wind at the summit had dropped the ambient temperature to somewhere around 45 degrees, and she'd been sweating through the climb and the fight, and now the cold was doing what cold did when you were wet and elevated and recently beaten. She began to disassemble the rifle. Not because she was planning to leave immediately. The descent required functional legs, and she might needed a few minutes to assess whether hers would cooperate, but because the discipline of the task gave her something to put her hands to while her mind processed what she'd just done and what it meant. She'd blown her cover. Not conclusively, not yet. The cover might survive if she was careful, if no one had seen her on the summit, if the man who'd run was not debriefed by anyone with the right questions to ask. But the probability was low. The rifle existed. The shots had been fired. The summit position would be found and analyzed, and the ballistic evidence would tell a story, and that story would not be consistent with a civilian kitchen contractor. She'd known that when she started climbing. The math hadn't changed. 400 operators. No air. No other option she could see. The arithmetic of it had been simple in the way that the worst decisions were always simple once you stripped away everything except what mattered. She didn't regret it. She was, however, beginning to feel the specific weight of having made a decision that couldn't be unmade, sitting in the cold on top of a 900-foot cliff with 2 cracked ribs and a rifle she couldn't resupply, listening to the sounds of a battle she'd altered but not ended, still echoing up from the canyon below. She made it off the cliff in 94 minutes. The descent was worse than the climb in the specific way that descents were always worse. Less momentum, more dependence on grip strength, the full knowledge of what was below you at every step rather than the optimistic ignorance of looking up. Her knee cooperated for the first 300 feet and then began to introduce a pulling Grinding sensation on the left side that suggested the ligament she'd partially stressed in a training accident 14 months ago had opinions about being asked to perform below a recent hand-to-hand engagement. She stopped twice. Not to rest. Resting was a negotiation with her body that she didn't have time for, but to recalibrate her route when the holds she'd mapped on the way up proved less reliable in the different light and her own altered physical state. She reached the base of the cliff at approximately 11:47. The base was quieter than she'd expected. Not silent. A forward operating base could not be silent when a major engagement had just concluded 3 kilometers away with a full combined arms element. But the particular quality of the noise had shifted from the sharp, urgent frequency of active crisis to something lower and longer, the sound of people processing and assessing rather than reacting. She came around the eastern perimeter fence and entered through the maintenance gate, which she'd propped with a rock on her way out in a way that was not sanctioned by any access control protocol and would, if anyone had noticed it, have generated a security concern that she would have had to explain. Nobody had noticed. She moved along the back wall of the contractor housing block, rifle case against her body, kit unchanged, doing the things she'd spent 11 years learning to do, moving through a space in a way that didn't invite questions by moving with the specific quality of someone who belonged exactly where they were going. She was 12 feet from the door to her quarters when the voice came from behind her. "Hey!" She stopped, turned slowly. Staff Sergeant Tyrell Macon was leaning against the wall of the adjacent building with his arms crossed and an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. He was one of the Ranger squad leaders, 30 years old, solid as a telephone pole, the kind of man whose face had been weathered beyond his age by a sequence of deployments that had started before most of his current subordinates had graduated high school. She'd poured his coffee approximately 80 times. He was looking at this rifle case. "That's a long bag for kitchen equipment," he said. Emma held his gaze. "Cleaning supplies." "Uh-huh." He didn't move, didn't look away. "I've been standing here for about 20 minutes, watched you come around the south perimeter wall. I went for a walk. In full kit. I walk fast." Macon was quiet for a long moment. His eyes went to her knee, which was, she was aware, visibly tracking blood through the tear in her cargo pants. Then to her left arm, where the burned fabric of her sleeve had started to separate from the skin beneath it in a way that was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Then back to her face. "The guys coming back through the egress," he said slowly. "They're saying somebody opened the pass. Killed the overwatch, killed the spotter. Nobody knows where the shots came from." He paused. "There's a summit back there, behind the base. One of our guys thought he heard something up there during the engagement." Emma said nothing. "Captain Voss wants to know who the shooter was," Macon continued. "He's not the only one." "I wouldn't know anything about that," Emma said. "I've been working the kitchen." Macon looked at her for a long, steady moment. The look of a man who had enough experience to recognize when he was being given a story and enough discipline to understand when pushing on a story was not the right move. "You need a medic," he said finally. "I'm fine." "Your knee is—" "I'm fine," she said again, and the way she said it was not angry and not warm and not anything except absolutely certain. Macon uncrossed his arms. He turned slightly and looked at the eastern ridge, where the canyon systems were still producing thin smoke columns against the midday sky. 400 guys came back alive today, he said quietly. Not to her exactly, to the air between them. Whoever did that, whatever they are, whatever their story is, that's not something that gets forgotten. He pushed off the wall and walked away without looking back. Emma watched him go. Then she opened the door to her quarters, went inside, put the rifle case in the corner, and sat down on the edge of the bunk. She pulled the first aid kit from under the mattress, the real one, not the standard contractor issue kit with its 4 bandages and its antiseptic wipes, but the field-grade kit she maintained with the same attention she gave the rifle, and began to work on her knee. The ribs would have to wait. There was nothing to be done about ribs in the field except tape them and breathe through it, and she didn't have the wrap in front of her, and she was very, very tired. She sat with her hands on her knee and looked at the wall and listened to the sounds of the base returning to something like normal around her. Through the thin wall, she could hear Okafor shouting at someone about the lunch service, his voice carrying the specific register of a man who believed that the efficient provision of food was among the highest callings available to a human being, and was perpetually disappointed in the world's failure to share this conviction. Something about that sound, the absolute ordinary fury of it, the complete indifference to everything that had happened in the last 4 hours, made Emma close her eyes and put her head against the wall and breathe. She stayed like that for a while. By 1400, the returning element had completed its initial assembly at the vehicle staging area, and FOB Black Mesa was operating with the specific fractured energy of a post-engagement environment, the simultaneous presence of relief, exhaustion, grief, adrenaline residue, and the bureaucratic imperative to document everything before memory softened the edges. Casualty numbers were still being confirmed. Emma gathered what she could from Okafor, who gathered everything from a ranger cook named Petty, who talked the way some people breathed, continuously, with minimal concern for relevance. 7 KIA, 31 wounded, of which 9 were serious, 14 vehicles destroyed or mission killed. The HVT, the bomb maker Operation Iron Falcon, had been designed to capture, had not been recovered from the target location, which was either because the intelligence had been wrong about his schedule or because someone had warned him, and the determination of which would occupy the intelligence community for the next several weeks. The mission, by the standard metrics, had been a qualified disaster that had been prevented from becoming a total disaster by some combination of factors that were still being assessed. Emma heard all of this while preparing the hot meal for the returning element, moving through the kitchen with the automatic competence of someone whose hands knew their work well enough to free her mind for other processing. She diced, she stirred, she checked temperatures, she restocked the serving line, and she thought about the man who had run from the summit plateau. He had seen her face. Not clearly. The engagement had been fast and the light on the plateau had been harsh, and she'd been in motion most of the time. But he'd been close enough at one point. Close enough. And whoever had sent 4 trained operators up a 900-foot cliff to check a summit position during a complex ambush had done so because they had a reason to suspect that position was occupied. Which meant someone had been watching the base, which meant the intelligence picture was worse than the post-engagement debrief was probably going to reflect, because the debrief would focus on what had happened in Red Fang Pass, not on what had been observing FOB Black Mesa from outside the wire. She needed to report this. To her handler. To someone with the right clearances and the right context to understand what it meant that a team of trained operators had been pre-positioned to counter a summit sniper during an ambush that had also included a pre-planned horseshoe geometry and a deliberate weather window. She needed to do it carefully. And before she did any of it, she needed to get through the next several hours without anyone looking too closely at the kitchen contractor with the blood on her cargo pants and the way she was holding her left side when she thought no one was watching. She spooned beef stew into the steam tray and adjusted the serving ladle to the correct angle and did not wince when the motion pulled across her ribs. Okafor appeared at her elbow. He looked at her. He looked at the steam tray. He looked back at her. "You look terrible," he said. "Thank you, Denny." "I mean it. You look like you got hit by something." "I tripped on the perimeter walkway this morning, the drainage grating near the east maintenance gate." Okafor stared at her with the expression of a man who had been dealing with people and their stories for a very long time. "You should see the medic. After service." "Brooks? After service," she said. The tone again, the one that closed the conversation. He went back to his clipboard. Emma stirred the stew and watched the dining facility fill as the first wave of returning operators came through the door, and she thought about the man who had run from the summit, and she thought about the intelligence leak that had compromised her mission 18 months ago, and she thought about the specific chain of events that had begun at 0741 this morning when she'd left the kitchen and started climbing. The returning operators moved through the line with the weighted quiet of men who had been in a fight and come out the other side. Some were still in bloodied kit. Some had the particular hollow look around the eyes that appeared when the adrenaline was gone and the full accounting hadn't been done yet. Most of them took their food without looking at Emma, except one. Captain Voss went through the line last. He was still in his mission kit, helmet clipped to his chest rig, face carrying 2 days of dust and approximately 4 hours of something that had shaken him in a way that his natural confidence hadn't fully processed yet. He stopped in front of Emma. He put his tray down on the counter. He looked at her for a long moment. "The weather call you made this morning," he said, "about the pressure drop and the sandstorm." "Yes. You were right. Aircraft were grounded within an hour of the convoy entering the pass." He paused. You knew that was going to happen. Emma held his gaze steadily. I mentioned I'd noticed the pressure. You did. His eyes moved briefly, just briefly, to her left arm and the damaged fabric of her sleeve, then back to her face, and there was something working behind his eyes that was not yet a conclusion, but was building toward one. You were at breakfast until approximately 0740, and then Sergeant Okafor says you were out for several hours. I needed air. Several hours of air. It's a big base. Voss was quiet. He picked up his tray. Somebody saved 400 people today, he said. From a summit position on the cliff behind this base, firing at ranges that... He stopped, looked at the tray. I'd like to shake that person's hand. He walked away to find a table. Emma watched him go. Then she looked down at the serving counter and found that her right hand had gripped the edge of it hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale, and she made herself release it slowly, one finger at a time. She was still thinking about the man who had run, and she was thinking about the fact that among the 4 operators who had come up that cliff, trained, equipped, pre-positioned, only 3 had been carrying standard configuration equipment. The 4th one, the one who'd dropped off the shelf above her, the one she'd wounded and left alive when she should have been more certain about the outcome. His kit had been different. Not dramatically different, but different enough for someone who looked at that kind of detail to matter. American pattern webbing, American pattern radio setup, American pattern everything. She'd been so focused on surviving the engagement that she hadn't let herself complete the thought on the summit. She let it complete now, standing behind the serving counter in the dining facility, watching Captain Voss settle into a chair 30 feet away. The operators who had come up that cliff hadn't come from outside the wire. They'd come from inside it. The thought sat in her chest like a piece of shrapnel, the kind that didn't kill you immediately, but that the body couldn't expel, that just stayed there, working its way deeper every time you breathed. American pattern webbing, American pattern radio setup. She served the last of the returning element their food with steady hands and a face that gave nothing away. And she turned the thought over and over in the back of her mind, the way a mechanic turned a component in failing light, looking for the mark that told him which way it was supposed to go. It didn't have to mean what it looked like it meant. American pattern equipment showed up in a lot of places it wasn't supposed to be. Captured gear, purchased gear, gear that moved through intermediary networks with no particular loyalty to its origin country. She knew that. She'd spent years in environments where the provenance of equipment was the least reliable thing about it. But the movement pattern, the tactical discipline, the specific way they'd spread across the plateau to deny her a single angle of coverage, that wasn't something you picked up from captured gear. That was trained into you over months and years, in specific programs, in specific ways. She put it aside. Not because it wasn't important, it was the most important thing she'd learned today. But because she couldn't do anything with it right now, here, behind a serving counter, with Captain Voss 30 feet away, eating beef stew and looking at her like she was a math problem he almost had the answer to. She needed the secure line, the one she'd been given at the start of the assignment, memorized, never written down, to be used only in the event of something that couldn't wait for the regular reporting cycle. She'd used it exactly once in 4 months to report an anomaly in the vehicle traffic pattern outside the wire that had turned out to be a logistics timing shift and nothing more. This was not a logistics timing shift. After service, after cleanup, after Okafor ran through his end-of-day accounting with the clipboard and the expression of quiet suffering that was his natural state, Emma walked to the communications trailer at the northeast corner of the compound. Not the main comms center, the secondary trailer, the one that handled administrative and contractor support traffic, staffed by a single communications specialist named Holt, who worked alone and who had been told, on her first week at Black Mesa, that the civilian contractor in Building 7 had periodic encrypted traffic to her employer's corporate security office, and that he was to provide her access to the secure terminal when requested without logging the session content. Holt was 26 years old and appeared to have processed this instruction by deciding it was above his pay grade and proceeding to treat Emma with the specific and curious professionalism of someone who had made peace with not knowing things. She appreciated that about him. "Need the terminal?" she said when she knocked. He looked up from whatever he was reading, registered her face and her general condition, and looked back down. "You want me to?" "No, I need about 20 minutes. He picked up his coffee, stood, and walked out without another word. Emma sat down, pulled the keyboard toward her, and began to type. The response came back in 11 minutes, which was fast, faster than it should have been for a routine check-in, which meant someone on the other end had been waiting, which meant her handler already knew that something had happened today that was going to require a conversation. The message was brief. It always was. Confirm status. Confirm cover integrity. Stand by for contact 0300 local. She typed back a 2-word confirmation, cleared the terminal history through the 3-step process she'd been given, and left the trailer. 0300 local was 7 hours away. She had 7 hours to stay in place, stay invisible, and not do anything that accelerated whatever was already in motion. But she didn't sleep. She lay on the bunk in her quarters with her ribs taped. She'd done it herself finally, pulling the elastic wrap from the medical kit and working through the process with a patience that was mostly stubbornness. And she looked at the plywood ceiling and listened to the bass settle into its nighttime rhythms around her. The sounds changed after midnight. The operational tempo dropped, the human traffic thinned, and what remained was the rotating guard schedule, the distant sound of generators, and the occasional radio transmission drifting from the operations center across the compound. She thought about Macon, the way he'd looked at her case, then at her face, then made the decision to say nothing operational and walk away. She thought about Voss and the thing that had been building behind his eyes at the serving counter. She thought about the 4 operators on the summit and the one who had run and the specific direction he'd run in, northeast, toward the gully system that ran down off the back of the ridge and came out, if you traced it on a map, approximately half a kilometer north of the main gate. Half a kilometer north of the main gate was the vehicle staging area. She turned that over. If someone inside the wire had sent those 4 men up the cliff, they would have needed a reason. Not a general reason. A specific one. Actionable. Timed to the engagement. Which meant whoever had sent them had known about the summit position before the engagement began, or had been watching for it once the engagement started, or had been told to watch for exactly this kind of contingency response. All 3 of those possibilities led to the same uncomfortable place. At 0257, she got up, dressed in civilian contractor clothing, jeans, base layer, a fleece, falsi that covered the tape around her ribs, and walked to the communications trailer. Holt was not there. There was a note on the keyboard that said, "Gone till 0400, H," which was not standard protocol, but was, she suspected, Holt's way of maintaining his chosen ignorance with maximum efficiency. At exactly 0300, the terminal pinged. The connection was text only, encrypted end-to-end through a routing system that bounced the traffic through enough intermediary nodes that tracing the origin would require more resources than anyone would casually dedicate to a contractor support line. On the other end was a voice she hadn't heard since her last debrief, rendered into text by a transcription system that had been calibrated to capture low speech volume conversations in secure environments. Her handler's name was not something she used in writing, even in encrypted writing. She thought of him as Carver, which was not his name, because she'd learned early in her career that giving people names that weren't their names was a useful form of mental compartmentalization. The transcript came through in bursts. "We have a full picture of today. The engagement is documented. Your actions will require a formal accounting, but that's not the immediate concern." She typed, "Understood. Immediate concern is the summit team. I need you to tell me they were adversarial." A pause. Longer than she liked. "We're working on that." "That's not an answer. It's the answer I have right now." "What's your read?" She thought about how to say it concisely to someone who would understand the implications without requiring explanation. American kit. Trained movement pattern. Prepositioned. They didn't come over the wire. The approach vector traces back to inside the compound. Another pause. "You're certain." "I'm certain about the kit and the approach vector. I'm not certain about the authorization chain, but you have a theory." She looked at the ceiling of the trailer for a moment. "I have an observation. The summit position wasn't obvious. I scouted it over 6 weekends. Nobody on this base should have known it was viable unless they'd done the same reconnaissance or been told by someone who had." The response took longer this time. "Stand by." She waited 4 minutes, watching the cursor blink on the screen. New instruction. Do not move against any identified personnel without authorization. Do not discuss summit events with base personnel. Maintain cover. We're sending someone. Who? Someone you'll recognize. 48 hours. What happens in 48 hours if... 48 hours, Brooks. Stay in the kitchen. The connection dropped. Emma sat in the dark of the communications trailer and looked at the screen for a long moment. Stay in the kitchen. She thought about what that meant in practical terms. She thought about the man who had run from the summit and who had, by now, had 16 hours to report what he'd seen. She thought about whoever had sent those 4 men up the cliff and whether that person was still on this base and what they were doing with the information that their team had not come back. She walked back to her quarters in the cold desert night and lay down on the bunk and watched the ceiling. Stay in the kitchen. She'd been staying in the kitchen for 4 months. She was good at it. The question was whether the kitchen was going to stay around her. The next morning arrived the way mornings arrived at FOB Black Mesa in the aftermath of a bad operation. Slower, heavier, with a quality of silence that was different from the normal pre-dawn quiet. The dining facility filled at the usual time, but with a different composition. More people sitting alone, more trays going half-finished, more conversations that stopped when someone new arrived rather than continuing. Grief moved through a military unit the way weather moved through terrain. Not uniformly, not on a schedule, but in patterns that experienced people could read. Emma read them while she worked. 7 KIA. She'd known the number since the previous afternoon, but numbers were abstractions until the morning after, when the absence of specific people became concrete in specific ways. The chair that was empty at the corner table where a fire team always sat, the mug that someone had left on the counter that nobody moved, the sergeant from 2nd Ranger Battalion, who normally ate with the energy of a man who considered breakfast a competitive event, sitting alone with his tray barely touched, looking at the table. Emma refilled his coffee without being asked and moved on. She was working the serving line at 07:15 when Macon came through. He looked like he'd slept approximately as well as she had, which was to say, not at all, and he moved through the line with the mechanical efficiency of someone eating out of discipline rather than appetite. When he reached her position, he held his tray and looked at her with the same unreadable steadiness he'd had the previous afternoon. "You put the tape on yourself?" he said, low enough that only she could hear it. She didn't ask how he knew about the tape. "Yes." "You need to see the medic." "I'm fine, Sergeant." "I'm not going to keep saying that and watching you move like that and pretend I don't see it." "Then stop watching." He looked at her for a beat. "There's a debrief at 0900. Captain Voss, the SEAL's senior chief, the ISR team lead. They're trying to figure out the shooter." Another beat. "A few of the guys who were in the pass are saying the shots came from the summit. The angle, the timing, it's the only position that makes sense." Emma served him scrambled eggs. "Interesting." "Brooks." His voice dropped further. "I want to help." She looked at him directly for the first time in the conversation. His face was tired and honest in the way that faces were at 07:15, when people weren't yet performing for anyone. She believed that he meant it. She also believed that it didn't matter whether he meant it. "You can help," she said, "by eating your breakfast." He picked up his tray and went to find a table. Go. The debrief she couldn't attend produced results she heard about secondhand through the specific osmotic information transfer that occurred in every military facility, regardless of how compartmented the command structure intended it to be. People talked, other people overheard, and certain key details spread through the base population with the efficiency of a well-optimized communications network. By 1100, she'd gathered the following. Voss had briefed the incident commander that the summit position was confirmed as the origin of the long-range fires. A team sent up the cliff that morning had found the position, the bipod marks in the rock, the expelled brass, the blood evidence from her fight with the 4 operators, and had returned with a ballistic picture that suggested a single shooter. The brass was .338 Lapua. The position construction was professional grade, and the blood, specifically the blood in 2 distinct locations, consistent with 2 different individuals, had generated a conversation that Emma imagined had been uncomfortable for certain people in that room. 4 operators had gone up that cliff. 1 had come back. Nobody had officially reported where the other 3 were. That information gap, The fact that 3 of the operators from the summit assault were unaccounted for in any official capacity was not something that would survive indefinitely. Bodies on a cliff face got found. And when they were found, the questions about who they were and who had sent them were going to be significantly harder to manage than they were right now. Whoever had authorized that summit team was running out of time. And that meant Emma was too. She was restocking the dry goods in the back storage room at 1340 when she heard the boots. Not moving fast, not the urgent percussive sound of a response team, but the deliberate, measured cadence of people walking with purpose and authority, and the specific quality that came with knowing they could walk anywhere on this base they chose to. She set down the case of soup and turned. 3 men she didn't recognize filled the doorway. Not Ranger Regiment, not SEAL teams, not any standard special operations configuration. They wore civilian contractor clothing in the same way Emma wore civilian contractor clothing, which was to say completely correctly and entirely unconvincingly to anyone who was paying attention. The man in front was approximately 50, compact, with the kind of stillness in his eyes that came from having been in rooms where people decided difficult things for a long time. He looked at Emma the way she imagined very few people in this facility had looked at her since her arrival, like he knew exactly who he was looking at. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "walk with us." It wasn't a request. She assessed the 3 of them in the 2 seconds she had. The man in front was the decision-maker. The one on his left was operational support, the way he held himself, the way his right hand was positioned, the practiced non-aggression of his posture that was itself a form of aggression. The one on the right she couldn't read as cleanly, which was itself information. She took off her apron and hung it on the hook. "Where are we going?" she said. "Somewhere with chairs," the man in front said. Well, they took her to the secondary briefing room on the far side of the operations center, not the main briefing space, which was large and communal and would have been witnessed, but the smaller room used for sensitive compartmented discussions, with a single table, 6 chairs, and a door that closed with a deliberate, well-maintained click. She sat down. The man in front sat across from her. The other 2 positioned themselves at the edges of the room in a way that was professional and not subtle. "My name is Garrett Lund," the man said. He placed a credential wallet on the table and opened it. She read it and understood several things simultaneously: who he worked for, what tier of the organization, and why he'd arrived in 48 hours rather than longer. He'd already been in the theater. "You made contact with your handler last night," Lund said. "We've been in the region for 6 days. We came in behind Iron Falcon." He paused. "You understand what I mean by that?" She understood. "You were investigating the intelligence leak that set up the ambush. We were investigating a broader problem." He folded his hands on the table. "The summit team is part of it. I need to know everything you observed about those 4 operators. Not what you did. I have the physical evidence from the cliff. What you observed." Emma held his gaze. "You first." A very small pause. He almost smiled. "Fair enough. The ambush wasn't orchestrated externally. The geometry was too precise, the weather window was too deliberate, and the decision to counter the summit position demonstrates advanced knowledge of this base's terrain that can't be acquired from outside the wire. We have a penetration, at least one, possibly coordinated." He looked at her steadily. "Now you." She gave it to him in order. The kit configuration, the movement pattern, the approach vector from inside the compound, the specific way the 4th operator had maneuvered to the shelf above her position, which required knowing she was already below it, which required either visual observation or communication with someone who had it. Lund listened without interrupting and without writing anything down. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The one who ran," he said. "Which direction?" "Northeast, toward the vehicle staging area. Timeline from your summit engagement to when you reached the base perimeter. 94 minutes descent. He had a 2 to 3 minute head start at most." Lund looked at the man on his left. "He was back in position before the returning element cleared the egress," Lund said. "We have him on camera at the vehicle staging area at approximately 12:10, which means he reported in," Emma said. "Yes." "Then whoever authorized the summit team knows the team failed and knows what I look like." "Correct." She let the weight of that sit for a moment. "And you want me to stay in place?" "For now." For now. She looked at him. Lund, if they know what I look like and they know their team failed, the next step isn't another hit team. The next step is making me disappear through official channels. A report. A security concern. Something that gets me off this base before I can talk to anyone. He held her gaze. I know. So staying in place is necessary. He said it flatly, without apology. Because if we move you, whoever did this knows we've identified the penetration, and they burn everything and we lose the threat entirely. Right now, they don't know who you are. Your cover is intact enough that they can't be certain. The woman on that cliff could still be explained several ways, he paused. If we're careful. Emma looked at the table for a moment. Staying in place, in this context, meant being a target. A deliberate, stationary target in an enclosed environment where the people who wanted her gone were also enclosed. She'd done it before. Twice. The variables had been different, but the essential architecture was the same. Hold the position, maintain the cover. Let the people with the bigger picture work the edges while you sat at the center of the problem and tried not to flinch. The first time had worked out. The second time was why she was here. I need names, she said. Everyone above the rank of 05 on this base who is read into Iron Falcon's execution timeline. I'm not asking for the investigation file. I'm asking who was in the room when the route was finalized. Because the horseshoe geometry required knowledge of the specific route, not just the general operation. Someone gave them the route. She met his eyes. Give me the list, and I'll work with it without touching anything directly. Lund studied her. You'll stay in the kitchen, he said, as long as you give me the list. Another pause. Then he reached into his jacket and put a folded piece of paper on the table between them. She opened it. 6 names. She read them once, twice, committed them to memory in the method she'd been using since the first year of her career, not verbatim memorization, but categorical association, attaching each name to a physical detail or behavioral marker that she'd already observed, so that the information lived in a part of her memory that was tactile and resistant to degradation. She folded the paper and slid it back to him. When will you have the camera footage analyzed? She said. By tonight. And when tonight, the door opened. Not knocked, not preceded by a voice. Opened directly, with the specific authority of someone who had decided that doors in their operational environment were things that opened when they chose. Captain Voss stood in the doorway. His eyes went immediately to Emma, then to Lund, then back to Emma, with the rapid processing of a man whose mind worked fast under information pressure and who had just walked into a room and understood in approximately 2 seconds that something was happening here that was significantly above what he'd expected. He stopped, started again. The duty NCO said there was a civilian interview in this room. His eyes tracked across the 2 men at the edges of the room. I didn't realize it was Captain Voss. Lund's voice was calm and controlled, the voice of a man who had managed this kind of situation before. You're welcome to wait outside. This is my operations center, and I appreciate the hospitality. Please wait outside. Voss did not move immediately. His eyes stayed on Emma and the thing that had been building behind them since the previous morning, the thing that had been accumulating evidence in the methodical way his particular kind of mind accumulated evidence, had reached a point where he was no longer going to be able to manage it with questions about the weather and observations about burnt bacon. Who are you? He said to Emma. Not aggressive. Not quite. The voice of a man asking a question he already suspected he knew the answer to and wasn't sure how he felt about that. Emma held his gaze. She thought about Carver's instruction, about Lund's instruction, about the 6 names on the paper she'd slid back across the table and committed to the part of her memory that held faces and details and the specific behavioral signatures of people who were doing one thing while appearing to do another. She thought about the 7 empty chairs at various tables in the dining facility that morning. Kitchen staff, she said quietly. You should wait outside, Captain. He looked at her for 3 more seconds. Something shifted in his face, not softening exactly, but a kind of settling. A man deciding to shelve what he knew in favor of what was required. He was better than she'd initially given him credit for. That first morning read on him had been too fast. He turned and walked back through the door, closing it without a word. Lund looked at her. The list, she said. Cross-reference the names with anyone who had access to the route finalization meeting and who also has a secondary communication profile that doesn't route through standard base infrastructure. Lund held her gaze for a moment. I'll be in contact. Through Holt? Through Holt. She stood, picked up nothing because she'd brought nothing, and walked to the door. Brooks. She stopped. The engagement yesterday, Lund said. The calls you made, the restraint you showed afterward. He paused in a way that she recognized as genuine rather than performed. That's not nothing. She opened the door. I know what it is. She walked back through the operations center and across the compound in the afternoon heat, past the rangers who looked up briefly and looked away again, past Macon, who was standing near the vehicle line and who watched her cross the open ground with an expression she didn't have time to interpret, back into the dining facility and through the kitchen and back to the serving counter where the afternoon prep was behind schedule because she'd been gone for an hour and 17 minutes. She put her apron back on. She picked up the serving ladle, and then, without warning, without any particular escalating sound, the camp's emergency alarm, not the general alert tone, but the internal security alarm, the one hardwired to a separate circuit for exactly the scenario where the primary communications infrastructure couldn't be trusted, went off with a sound like a metal door hitting a concrete wall. 3 short bursts. Repeated. Emma set the ladle down slowly. 3 short bursts on that alarm meant one thing in the base's security protocol. Not an external threat. Not a perimeter breach. Internal security compromise. Someone, or something, had been found. Emma looked at the kitchen around her. At the walls of a room she'd spent 4 months disappearing into. At the back exit and the compound beyond it, and the operations center where Lund and his 2 men were presumably still in the briefing room doing whatever came next in the sequence she'd just accelerated by 2 hours with her list request. She took off the apron. Okafor appeared from the storage corridor with wide eyes, and the clipboard held in front of him like it might provide some structural support. What is that? Internal security, Emma said. What does that mean? What do we... She was already moving toward the back exit. Stay here, she said. Do not open any doors for anyone you don't recognize. Brooks. She was gone. Outside, the alarm was louder, bouncing off the compound walls and the cliff face behind the base, in a way that made its direction difficult to triangulate. Personnel were emerging from buildings with weapons at low ready, moving in the automatic response patterns of their individual training, looking for a vector and not finding one. 2 rangers near the operations center were on radios. The duty officer was standing in the center of the compound with a headset on, rotating slowly, a man trying to read a map that was being redrawn in real time. Emma moved toward the vehicle's staging area, not because she was certain that was the right direction, because it was the direction she'd been thinking about since the previous afternoon, and because the man who had run from the summit had ended up there, and because if someone inside this base was moving, now, triggered by something, possibly by Lund's arrival, possibly by her meeting in the briefing room, possibly by the camera footage being reviewed, they would need wheels. She came around the northwest corner of the motor pool and stopped. 3 vehicles were idling that shouldn't have been idling, and in front of the center one, having what appeared to be a very fast and very low-volume conversation with the driver, was a man whose name she'd read on Lund's list. He hadn't seen her yet. She had approximately 4 seconds before he did. Emma did not have a weapon. She was in civilian clothing with taped ribs and a knee that had opinions, and she was standing in the motor pool of a forward operating base during an active internal security alarm, looking at the person who had, with a very high probability, just handed 7 American soldiers' death coordinates to an enemy network. 4 seconds. She used the first one to accept that the next several minutes were going to be improvised entirely. She used the second to identify the angles. She used the third to start moving, and she used the fourth to decide that Lund's instruction to stay in the kitchen had officially expired. The man's name was Major Dennis Calloway, 41 years old, 15 years of service. Read into Iron Falcon's execution timeline as the base's senior intelligence officer, the person responsible for validating the route, confirming the target location, and signing off on the threat assessment that had told 400 operators the canyon was clear. Emma had read his name on Lund's list and placed it immediately against the behavioral markers she'd accumulated over 4 months. The way he moved through the dining facility without looking at anyone directly. Not the distracted non-attention of a busy officer, but the studied non-contact of someone practicing invisibility in an environment where he couldn't afford to be read. The way he'd eaten alone 3 times in the past week, which for a senior staff officer in a close-quarters FOB was unusual enough to register. The way he'd been the only person in the operations center that morning who hadn't looked toward the eastern ridge when the weapons fire started coming through the walls. Everyone else had looked. He'd looked at his desk. She had 4 seconds before he turned and saw her, and she spent none of them on hesitation. The motor pool was arranged in 3 rows, vehicles nose in against a concrete barrier, engines running on the 3 that were idling, 2 MRAPs and a lighter utility vehicle that had its rear cargo door open, and a duffel bag on the ground beside it that was the wrong shape for personal gear. 2 flat on one side, 2 rigid at the corners. Document cases, or communications equipment, or both. Whatever Calloway was moving, he'd been planning to move it before Lund arrived. Lund's arrival had just accelerated the timeline. Emma came around the front of the nearest MRAP fast enough that she was inside his peripheral range before he registered the movement and turned. When he turned, she was 6 feet from him, and for the specific half-second where the human threat assessment process raced to catch up with the visual stimulus, neither of them moved. Then he recognized her. Not from the dining facility. The recognition was different, sharper. The recognition of someone who had been given a description and was matching it now to the face in front of him. The summit. The 4th operator had given him enough. "Stop," Emma said. Calloway didn't stop. He stepped back and his hand went toward his hip. She closed the distance in 2 steps and used the motion of his own arm against him. Not gracefully, not the clean technique that worked in a controlled environment, but the functional ugly version that worked when your ribs were taped and your knee was angry and you needed to get a weapon out of someone's hand before they finished drawing it. She got his wrist, torqued it inward, and put her weight through the joint at an angle that biology didn't accommodate. He made a sharp sound. The weapon didn't clear the holster. He was bigger than her and he recovered faster than she expected, using his mass to pull them both sideways into the side of the utility vehicle with enough force that the impact went through her left side like a current. The taped rib screamed. She kept her grip on his wrist and didn't let it translate into her face because the moment it did, he would know exactly where to push. The driver of the utility vehicle, she'd clocked him in her peripheral, late 30s, contractor clothing. The specific stillness of someone trying to decide whether to get involved made the decision to get involved. He came around the front of the vehicle and she had less than a second before he reached her. "Contact, motor pool." The voice came from behind her, loud and sharp, and the driver stopped like he'd walked into a wall. Macon. He came around the rear of the nearest MRAP with his sidearm drawn and held at a downward angle that was not pointed at anyone yet but communicated, without ambiguity, that this was a conditional state. 2 Rangers were a step behind him. The driver looked at Macon, looked at the weapon, put his hands up. Calloway stopped pulling. Emma released his wrist, stepped back 2 feet, and kept herself between him and the vehicle. The motor pool was very quiet for a moment, except for the idling engines and the still active alarm bouncing off the compound walls. "What the hell?" Macon said. Flat, not a question. "Major Calloway needs to be detained," Emma said. "The vehicle and that bag need to be secured. Don't let either of them leave the motor pool." Macon looked at her, looked at Calloway. His face cycled through several things in quick succession. Confusion, assessment, the specific internal reckoning of a man being asked to detain a superior officer by a kitchen contractor, and then settled into something harder and simpler. "Ortega," he said to one of the Rangers behind him, without looking away from Calloway. "Get on the radio. Get the duty officer and whoever those suits are in the briefing room, right now." Ortega was already moving. Calloway looked at Emma with a steadiness that was worse than anger would have been. Anger was readable, manageable, something you could work with. This was the stillness of a man calculating, a man who had spent 15 years in intelligence work and knew that the next 30 minutes would determine a very great deal, and who was doing the math on what his remaining options were. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "I know exactly what I'm doing. You have no idea what was actually at stake in—" "7 people are dead," Emma said. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "I'll hear the rest of it in a room with people who have the authority to charge you." Calloway closed his mouth. Macon looked at Emma across the 3 feet of motor pool space between them. his expression doing something complicated that she didn't have the bandwidth to fully interpret right now. "You want to tell me what is happening?" "When Lund gets here," she said. "Who's Lund?" "The man in the briefing room." Macon looked at Calloway, who had the absolute stillness of someone who had made a decision about how to play the next phase, and then back at Emma. He holstered his sidearm, but didn't relax. "Okay," he said slowly. "Okay, well, Lund arrived 4 minutes later with his 2 men and the duty officer, a first lieutenant named Park, who was 27 years old and processing the scene in the motor pool with the visible effort of a man trying to insert an unexpected variable into a formula that hadn't accounted for it. Lund took one look at the setup: Emma, Calloway, the idling vehicle, the duffel bag on the ground, and the careful blankness of his face did something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. "Major Calloway," he said, "I've been looking for you." "I want a JAG officer," Calloway said immediately. "I want a lawyer before I say anything." "You'll have one. That's not a problem." Lund looked at the duffel bag. "Miles, secure the bag." The man on his left moved immediately. "Lieutenant Park, I need the motor pool cleared of non-essential personnel, and I need the 3 idling vehicles secured in place." Park, to his credit, started executing before the sentence was fully finished. Lund turned to Emma. She was standing with her left arm pressed slightly against her side, in a way she wasn't fully conscious of, until she noticed him noticing it. "You left the kitchen," he said. "He was in the motor pool." "I told you. The timeline moved," she said. "Your arrival moved it. He was going to be gone within the hour." Lund held her gaze. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man reassessing a variable and not entirely displeased with what the reassessment produced. "The camera footage came back 20 minutes ago," he said, low enough that only she could hear it. "We have him on the base communication system accessing a secondary channel 6 hours before the convoy departed. The routing trace goes to a commercial satellite node that's been associated with the network before." He paused. "We have enough." Emma looked at Calloway, who was standing between Lund's 2 men with his hands at his sides and his face completely composed in the way that faces became completely composed when the person wearing them had run the numbers and accepted an outcome. "The summit team," she said to Lund. "He authorized them." "We believe so. Confirmed once we have the footage cross-referenced." He knew about the summit position. "The reconnaissance you did over 6 weekends was logged in the base activity records as extended perimeter familiarization walks. It's possible he identified the pattern and ran a terrain analysis on where that pattern would logically end up." Lund looked at her steadily. Or someone told him. She understood what he was leaving unsaid. The possibility that the intelligence leak that had compromised her mission 18 months ago and the penetration at FOB Black Mesa were connected threads of the same network. It was a large possibility. "I need to be part of the debrief," she said. "You will be. Not as a witness, as an analyst." Lund studied her for a long moment. "That's a conversation that involves people who aren't standing in a motor pool." "Then let's go find a room with chairs," she said. "That's what you said earlier. That was the offer." Something moved across his face that she thought might have been the closest he came to an unguarded expression. "The offer was an interview." "The offer has been renegotiated by circumstances," she said. "I have 4 months of behavioral observation on this base. I have the summit engagement evidence. I have the motor pool intercept. And I have the beginning of a connection to an 18-month-old compromise that your people haven't been able to close. I'm not a witness. I'm an asset that's been running passive collection from inside your problem for 4 months." She met his eyes. "Use me correctly." The motor pool was almost clear now. Park had moved the non-essential personnel back, and the 3 vehicles were being secured by the Rangers. Calloway stood with the 2 men in a silence that was, Emma thought, the silence of a man who had already begun constructing his next move from whatever remained available to him, because that was what people like Calloway did. They were never finished. They were only paused. Lund looked at his watch, then at Emma. "Can you walk without advertising it?" Her ribs had strong opinions about that question. "Yes." "Then walk with me." The next 4 hours happened in the main briefing room, which had been cleared and swept, and was now occupied by a configuration of people that Emma had not expected, and that told her, the moment she walked in, that whatever was happening here was operating at a level above what Lund had indicated. Captain Voss was there, which surprised her. So was the SEAL's senior chief, a weathered man named Garvey, who had the economy of movement of someone who'd been doing this long enough that efficiency had become aesthetic. So was a woman Emma didn't recognize, late 40s, civilian, the particular brand of professional neutrality that Emma associated with oversight functions. Sitting at the far end of the table with a recorder and a closed laptop, and sitting to the left of Lund's position with a cup of coffee and an expression of complete composed attention was a man Emma had not seen in 14 months. She stopped in the doorway. The man looked up. He had the kind of face that was difficult to age, somewhere between 50 and 60, lean, with gray at the temples and eyes that were the specific pale color that photographed as colorless in most lights. His name, in the context of the work, was not a name she used out loud. She knew him as Kellner. He was not, as far as anyone in this room probably understood, simply another analyst. He looked at her in the way that people looked at each other when they had a history that couldn't be acknowledged in the current company and had practiced over years the specific skill of communicating across that history with nothing but the angles of their faces. She sat down. Lund began. The briefing that followed was not the kind Emma had been in as a participant before. Usually she was the subject, the asset being debrief, the person on the receiving end of questions. This was different. Lund ran it as a synthesis session, pulling from multiple sources simultaneously. The camera footage on the laptop at the center of the table, the ballistic report from the summit, the behavioral analysis from the base activity records, and Emma herself, who was asked questions that were pointed and specific and that she answered with the same directness. "Walk me through the route reconnaissance," Lund said. 6 weekends. What was the decision process for selecting the summit as a viable position? Emma talked. She covered the terrain analysis, the elevation calculation, the view corridor from the summit to the canyon floor, the specific factors, wind, atmospheric density, the natural cover formation at the southern edge, that had made it the only viable long-range position available if someone needed to effect a battle in Red Fang Pass from outside the engagement area. Voss was listening with the focused attention of a man filling in pieces of a picture that had been assembling itself in his mind since the previous morning. He didn't interrupt. He wrote 2 things down, and the second time he wrote something down, he glanced at Emma in a way that was different from the previous day's glances. Recalibrated, the way a compass recalibrated when the magnetic reference changed. "The shot distance on the primary HVT," Garvey said, speaking for the first time. He had a coast accent, not Californian, something further north. "The first significant shot, ranging estimate from the ballistic team put it at approximately 2,000 meters. 2,040, Emma said. Garvey looked at her. The room was quiet. "Wind call," he said. "At that range with the thermal variance from the canyon floor, 12 to 14 miles per hour, northwest primary, with a cross component from the canyon thermal. The cross component ran approximately east-southwest at 4 to 6 miles per hour, cyclical, tied to the sun angle on the west canyon wall." She paused. The window between gusts was running on a 17 to 20 second cycle. "I timed 3 cycles to confirm before taking the first shot." Another silence. "You took the first shot in the second of the second window," Garvey said. It wasn't a question. He was reading from the ballistic team's reconstruction. "The 4th cycle," she corrected. "I waited for the 4th to confirm the pattern was stable." Garvey put his pen down. Voss had stopped writing. The woman at the far end of the table, who had not spoken since Emma entered the room, was looking at her with an expression that was professionally neutral and personally quite something else. Kellner was still holding his coffee. His face had not changed. He'd heard this before. Not the specific accounting, but the category of it, the thing it represented, because he was one of the people who had trained her to do it. 9 confirmed hits from 11 shots, Lund said, at ranges between 1,400 and 2,040 meters. In a wind environment that your own ballistic team described as, he checked the report, anomalously complex. He looked up. Under fire, with degraded physical condition. "Not at the start," Emma said. "The degraded condition developed progressively." "Still, the number isn't remarkable," she said, and she meant it. The conditions were difficult, but the position was good and the observation time was sufficient. What was remarkable was that nobody had done it earlier. Voss made a quiet sound that might have been a laugh and might have been something else. He covered it by picking up his water. "We need to talk about Calloway," Kellner said. The room shifted slightly. Not physically, but the attention in the room reorganized itself in the subtle way that happened when the person with the most authority in a space spoke for the first time. Voss looked at Kellner with the expression of someone noticing that the hierarchy he'd assumed for the past hour was not the actual hierarchy. Lund nodded. "The camera footage confirms the communication sequence. The routing traces to the network. The timing is consistent with a pre-Iron Falcon warning, which means the route compromise happened inside the 48-hour execution window." He paused. He had access. He had the channel, and he had motive. "What's the motive?" Voss said. Lund looked at Kellner. Kellner set down his coffee. "Calloway was flagged 18 months ago during a different investigation," Kellner said. "Financial indicators. Nothing actionable at the time. Enough to open a file, not enough to move on. The flag was documented, assigned for monitoring, and then a different event took priority." He paused. "A mission compromise in a separate theater that required the extraction of an asset." The room understood, without being told directly, that the asset being referred to was Emma. Voss looked at her. She met his look evenly. "The mission compromise 18 months ago and Calloway's financial flag," Voss said slowly. "Are they the same network?" "We believe so," Kellner said. "Confirming that connection is now the priority. Calloway's cooperation, or lack of it, will determine the timeline." "He's asked for a lawyer," Lund said. "He'll get one. In the meantime, the communication records are being pulled through every system he touched in the last 6 months. Voss leaned back in his chair. He looked at the table for a moment. The specific look of a man absorbing the information that the people responsible for the security of his operation had been running a penetration for at minimum 18 months, that 7 of his soldiers were dead because of it, and that the person who had identified and acted on the problem was the woman he'd spoken to about the weather over a breakfast tray. "The kitchen," he said. 4 months. That was your cover." "Yes." "And the 6 weekends of terrain walks." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "The weather call yesterday morning, the pressure drop." "Yes." "You knew." Not accusing, processing. "I knew the weather was wrong for the mission profile. I didn't know the ambush was staged at that point. I had concerns." "Concerns?" He looked at her steadily. "Why didn't you say something?" It was a fair question. She'd known it was coming, and she'd prepared an answer that was technically accurate and operationally complete. And that still didn't fully satisfy her when she said it. "Because one weather observation isn't an actionable intelligence product," she said. "And because my cover didn't give me a channel to raise a tactical concern to the mission commander without creating questions I wasn't authorized to answer. By the time I had enough information to be certain, the convoy was already in the pass." Voss held her gaze. He didn't look satisfied with the answer. She hadn't expected him to, but he nodded. "Sergeant Macon," he said. He wasn't looking for a response. He was assembling the picture aloud. "He saw you come back around the perimeter." "Yes." "He didn't report it." "No." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Good man," he said softly. It wasn't about the decision to not report. It was about something more complicated than that. And Emma thought Voss understood it the way a commander who'd spent enough time with good people learned to understand when someone's instincts were running ahead of the policy and the instincts were right. "What happens now?" Voss said to Kellner. "Calloway is transported for formal processing within 24 hours, Kellner said. The base returns to operational status under an adjusted command structure while the full scope of the penetration is mapped. The network connection to the 18-month-old compromise is pursued as a priority." He paused. "And we have a conversation about what happens with Ms. Brooks." Emma looked at Kellner. "That conversation," Kellner said, "doesn't happen in this room." It happened in a smaller room, 30 minutes later, with just the two of them and the sound of the base returning grudgingly to something like its normal rhythms outside the window. Kellner sat across from her at a table that was smaller and less formal than the briefing room, and for a long moment after the door closed, neither of them spoke. In the particular way of people who had a history that included a lot of silence and understood that silence was not the same as absence. "Your ribs," he said finally, "taped. I saw how you sat in there." "I sat fine." You held your left side getting through the door. She looked at him. Is that what we're starting with? He held her gaze. No. A pause. The stand-down was supposed to last another 8 months. The stand-down ended about 22 hours ago. I know. He studied her. How are you? It was the kind of question that meant something different from him than it meant for most people, because from him, it wasn't social infrastructure. He was genuinely asking about her operational state, her psychological condition, the complete inventory of whether the person across from him was intact. Emma thought about how to answer it honestly. I'm functional, she said. The physical damage is manageable. The decision architecture held. She paused. I'm not going to tell you it was clean because it wasn't. I had 4 months of cover and I burned it in 90 minutes, and part of me is still processing whether the calculation was right. The calculation was right, Kellner said. You weren't there. I have the outcomes. He said it without apology. 400 personnel recovered. Network penetration identified and interdicted. Active threat contained. The calculation was right. 7 people are dead. Yes. That's not a calculation that balances. No, he said. It doesn't. The honesty of that, the refusal to fold it into a larger framework where it came out clean, was one of the things that had made her trust him in the first place a long time ago. He never told her the math worked out when it didn't. He just told her the math was necessary. The stand down, she said. Is it over? He considered that. Not performing consideration, actually considering it, which she appreciated. That depends on what you want, he said. There's a path back to active operations. The work on this base over 4 months, and the summit engagement, and the motor pool, that's a complete operational picture that answers the questions the stand-down was supposed to answer. He folded his hands on the table. But there's also a path that doesn't go back. That's a legitimate path. After 11 years, it's a legitimate path. Emma looked at the window. Outside, the desert light was doing what it did in the late afternoon, turning everything amber and elongated, making the cliffs look like something out of a different era entirely. She'd looked at those cliffs every morning for 4 months from behind a serving counter. I burned my cover, she said. The cover served its purpose. I broke containment. I moved without authorization twice in 48 hours. You identified and interdicted a penetration that had been running for at minimum 18 months, Kellner said. The unauthorized movements were the mechanism of that outcome. He paused. The people who write the policies you technically violated would like to shake your hand. I don't want my hand shaken. I know. Another silence. The network connection, she said. The 18-month-old compromise in Callaway. If they're the same thread, they likely are, then there are other nodes. Almost certainly. I know what the compromise looked like from the inside, she said. I was there. I have the operational picture from the field side that your analysts are building from the signals side. She looked at him. I'm more useful on that problem than I am anywhere else. Kellner looked at her for a long moment. That's probably true. It's definitely true. The almost smile again. The arrogance I've missed. It's not arrogance. It's an accurate assessment. You're 37 years old with taped ribs and a knee that's been grinding audibly since you sat down, he said. The accurate assessment includes that. The accurate assessment includes that, she agreed, and it still comes out the same way. He stood up, which was his way of indicating that the conversation had reached its conclusion and that he'd heard everything he needed to hear. She stood with him, slowly enough that the ribs registered their formal objection. You'll be transported to a medical facility tonight for a proper assessment, he said. After that, the formal accountability process for the summit engagement. After that, he picked up the coffee cup, which had been empty for the last 20 minutes. We'll talk about what comes next. She nodded. Brooks. He paused at the door. Macon, the ranger sergeant who found you in the motor pool. What about him? He moved fast to that location, faster than the alarm would account for. She considered this. He was watching the motor pool. Yes, on his own initiative. On his own initiative. Kellner opened the door. He's a good man. That's what Voss said. They're both right. He stepped out. Emma stood in the empty room for a moment, and then she walked out into the corridor and back toward the operations center, and through it to the compound, where the alarm had finally stopped and the desert evening was beginning to come in from the east with its 20-degree temperature drop and its particular quality of silence. Macon was standing outside the dining facility. She wasn't sure if he'd been waiting or if it was coincidence. His face didn't give it away either direction. She stopped. "You're leaving tonight," he said. It wasn't a question. "Medical transport." He nodded. He looked at the cliff face behind the base, now in shadow, and then back at her. "I've been trying to figure out what to say for about 6 hours." "You don't need to say anything." "I know I don't need to." He looked at her. "I want to." Emma waited. "The summit," he said. "Whatever happened up there, whatever you are, whatever the story is." He stopped, searched for something, and apparently didn't find the exact version he wanted. "The guys who came back through that egress, they're alive. Some of them have kids. Some of them—" He stopped again. "Macon." He looked at her. "I know," she said. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once, the nod of a man who had said the thing he needed to say in the only language that was available to him at the moment. And she had understood it, and that was enough. He turned and walked back into the dining facility. Through the window, she could see the serving line, already being reset for the evening meal by a cook she didn't know, filling the steam trays with the mechanical competence of someone whose hands knew their work. The smell of coffee drifted through the screen door. Emma stood in the desert evening and breathed it in, and then she went to pack what remained of her cover identity into a bag that didn't weigh very much because 4 months of disappearing into a room had a way of traveling light. The bag took 11 minutes to pack. That was the whole accounting of 4 months at FOB Black Mesa. 11 minutes, 1 duffel, and a rifle case that she carried separately because it didn't fit the cover identity anymore, and she was done pretending it did. The contractor clothing went into the duffel. The kitchen ID badge she set on the windowsill. The first aid kit, the real one, she kept. The small mirror she left on the wall because it had come with the room and because she'd never owned it to begin with. She stood in the doorway and looked at the 12 by 12 space for approximately 5 seconds. Then she walked out and didn't look back, which was not sentiment and not discipline, but simply the way she'd learned to move through the world. Forward, always forward, because the thing behind you was already a different problem than the one in front of you, and dividing your attention between them was how people got killed. The medical transport was a helicopter, which arrived at 2140 with minimal announcement and the specific no-ceremony quality of all logistics that existed in the classified tier of operational support. 2 personnel she didn't know, a flight medic who looked at her ribs with the professionally suppressed reaction of someone who had seen worse, but not by a wide margin, and a crew chief who loaded the rifle case without asking what was in it, because in this context, asking what was in things was not the job. She was sitting in the cargo bay, ribs freshly retaped by the flight medic with considerably more skill than she'd applied herself, when Voss appeared at the helicopter door. He had to duck slightly to see in. The rotor wash was doing things to the desert dust around him that made the light strange. He wasn't in mission kit anymore. He'd changed into a clean uniform at some point in the last several hours, and without the dust and the operational intensity, he looked younger and more tired simultaneously. He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. "Captain," she said. "I don't know your actual name," he said. "I just realized that. After all of it, I don't know what to call you." "Brooks is fine." "Is it real?" "Real enough." He absorbed that. His hand was on the door frame and he looked at it briefly, then back at her. "I owe you an apology." "You don't. I called you the lunch lady," he said. "First week you were here," to another officer. I said. He stopped. "It doesn't matter exactly what I said. It was dismissive and I meant it that way and I was wrong." Emma held his gaze. "You didn't know." "That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not. But it's true." He was quiet for a moment. The rotor noise made silence between them a physical thing, something that had weight and presence. 7 people, he said. My people. If we'd moved differently, if I'd listened when you mentioned the weather. Don't, she said. I keep going back through it. Stop, she said, and her voice had the flat quality that she used when she needed someone to hear the instruction and not the emotion behind it. You made decisions based on the intelligence picture you were given. The intelligence picture was compromised by someone whose job was to give you a clean one. That's not your failure. That's his crime. Keep those two things separate, or the second one will hollow you out, and the first one doesn't deserve that. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face shifted. Not resolved, not healed, nothing so immediate or clean as that, but reorganized slightly, the way things reorganized when someone gave you a framework that was more useful than the one you'd been using. You're going after whoever else is in that network, he said. Not a question. That's not something I can talk about. I know. He straightened up slightly. The rotor wash was intensifying. The crew chief had one hand raised in the universal signal for 2 minutes. Whatever you do next, wherever it is, Captain. Yeah. You have good people, she said. Macon, the rest of them. Take care of them. He nodded once, the nod of a man who took that kind of thing seriously. You too, he said, which was an odd thing to say to a person who worked alone, but she understood what he meant by it. He stepped back from the door. She watched him shrink as the helicopter lifted, standing in the desert with the rotor wash flattening the dust around him, until the darkness took him, and there was nothing below except the lights of FOB Black Mesa arranged against the black terrain like something that looked, from altitude, fragile and deliberate and entirely human. She faced forward and watched the cliff face pass beneath them, the summit invisible in the dark. Just another piece of the terrain, indistinguishable from everything around it. The formal accountability process took 9 days. It happened in a facility she was not going to describe even in her own internal accounting, staffed by people whose names she was given once and would not use in writing, with a process that was methodical and thorough and not unkind. They pulled every decision she'd made from 0741 on the morning of the engagement through the motor pool intercept, and they asked about each one, and she answered each one with the same directness she'd used in the briefing room at Black Mesa. The 2 misses at 2,000 meters. She accounted for those. The decision to pursue when Callaway was at the vehicle. She accounted for that. The moment she'd held the final summit shot while actively under fire, prioritizing the mission below over her own immediate survival. They asked about that one twice from different angles, and she gave the same answer both times because it was the only answer she had. The target was in the open, the window was available, and the mission came before her personal situation. That was the rule. She'd lived by it for 11 years. Was there a moment, the woman conducting the primary session said, where you considered not engaging? Where you assessed the personal risk as outside acceptable parameters? Emma thought about the question honestly before answering it, which she always did. No, she said. Why not? Because the alternative was not engaging, and the cost of not engaging was 400 people in a stone canyon with no air support and an active enemy sniper. She paused. I don't experience that as a difficult calculation. The woman wrote something. Some people would. Some people haven't spent 11 years making that calculation. Is that experience a strength or a liability? Emma held her gaze. Both, she said, depending on the day. The woman wrote something else. On the 8th day, Kellner came. He sat across from her in the same neutral room where the accountability sessions had been conducted, and he looked somewhat less composed than he'd looked at Black Mesa, which she attributed to 8 days of working the Callaway thread and whatever it was producing. He's talking, Kellner said. What's the scope? Wider than Black Mesa. He'd been running a secondary channel for approximately 2 years. Financial motivation. Initially, the flag we had 18 months ago was the leading edge of it. He escalated to operational material over the last 14 months. He paused. He confirmed the connection to the mission compromise. Emma was very still. He was the relay, Kellner said. He didn't initiate the compromise, he passed the asset identification to an intermediary. He claims he didn't know the specific operational consequence. He looked at her steadily. Whether that's true or a mitigating strategy is something the lawyers will spend a long time on. It doesn't change the outcome of the compromise, Emma said. No, it doesn't. She looked at the table. 14 months ago, she'd been extracted from a mission that had been running for 2 years, under a cover that had taken 9 months to build, because someone in a building on a forward operating base had passed a piece of information to an intermediary who had passed it to an adversary network that had flagged her identity and determined that the most efficient response was not to move against her directly, but to flag her to local counterintelligence and let the resulting operational chaos accomplish the same thing with less exposure. It had worked. and the person who had been the relay point for that information had spent the subsequent 14 months at FOB Black Mesa with a senior intelligence officer credential and access to every operation that ran through the facility. The summit team, she said, contracted through the same intermediary network, not Americans. Equipment configured to pattern. Calloway hired them through 3 layers of separation and believed the layering was sufficient. A pause. It wasn't. We're working back through it. The one who ran. In custody as of 2 days ago. In a different country than you'd expect. He said it in a way that suggested the different country was itself information, something that connected to a larger map she was beginning to see the edges of. He saw my face, she said. He did. That's part of the current conversation. Kellner folded his hands. Your cover identity at Black Mesa is burned. That specific configuration is retired. The question is, what configuration comes next? Or if, she said. Or if, he agreed. That's still your choice. Emma looked at the wall behind him. 14 months ago, the choice had been made for her by events, and she'd processed it over the following months by converting the processing time into operational utility, the terrain walks, the behavioral observation, the maintenance schedule for a rifle she'd hoped she wouldn't need. That was how she'd managed the stand down, by never actually standing down. The network, she said, the thread Calloway opened, how many nodes? Estimated 5 to 7 active, 2 confirmed through his cooperation. The others require access that current collection doesn't provide. He held her gaze. Field access. In what theater? 2 theaters, one of which you know. She did know it. She'd spent 4 years there under a different identity, running different collection, and she knew its specific texture, its rhythms, its tells, the particular way information moved through it, and the particular gaps where it didn't. Timeline, she said. The preparation work is 8 to 12 weeks. Longer if we're building a new configuration from scratch. Shorter if we're working from existing infrastructure with modifications. What's the condition of the existing infrastructure? Intact, dormant, waiting. She looked at him. You left it in place. We left it in place. That's either very smart or very optimistic. I prefer to think of it as confidence in the inevitable, he said, and this time the almost smile was more complete than she'd seen it before. The accountability board closes tomorrow. The physical clearance from the medical team is contingent on the rib assessment, which the doctor tells me is healing faster than she expected. I told her it would. And the knee is structurally sound with a recommended rest period that you will not observe. Correct. All of which means, he said, that the path is available if you choose it. Emma was quiet for a moment, not weighing it. She'd been weighing it for 9 days in the neutral room between sessions. In the specific way she weighed things that had already been decided but needed the time to settle into the shape of a decision so that she could carry it without it shifting. I want the full network picture before I go in, she said. Everything Calloway gave you and everything your signals collection has. I want to build my own analysis against it. That can be arranged. And I want the new configuration built to my specifications on the cover, not adapted from a template, built from scratch to the environment. 8 weeks becomes 10. Then it becomes 10, Kellner nodded. Is there anything else? She thought about it. Macon, she said. Staff Sergeant Tyrell Macon, 75th Ranger Regiment. He made independent decisions over a 48-hour period that contributed materially to the outcome at Black Mesa. He acted on instinct when the institutional structure hadn't caught up to the situation. That should be documented somewhere it matters. Kellner looked at her for a moment. It will be. Without involving me in the documentation. Understood. He stood. She stood with him, and this time the ribs offered only a mild comment rather than a formal objection, which she took as progress. Brooks, he said. She looked at him. The accountability board asked me this morning for my assessment of the Black Mesa engagement. Overall conduct, overall judgment, the complete picture. He paused. I told them it was the most coherent operational performance I've seen from a solo asset under those conditions in 20 years. Emma held his gaze. I'm telling you, he said, because you should know that the people who matter in this world understand what you did. Not just the shooting, the whole thing, the 4 months, the decisions, the judgment. He picked up his folder. That's not nothing. He walked out. Emma stood in the neutral room and breathed slowly through the thing that his words had moved in her chest. Not pride exactly, not relief exactly, something more complicated and less nameable than either of those. The specific feeling of being seen accurately by someone whose assessment you trusted, which was rarer than any skill she'd ever developed. She sat back down and looked at the wall. Outside the facility, the world was continuing to be the world. People were doing what people did, driving and arguing and eating and sleeping and going about the business of lives that were, for the most part, entirely unaware of the network of invisible work that kept a certain kind of catastrophe from arriving at their door. She'd understood for a long time that this was the correct relationship between that work and the people it protected. The invisibility wasn't a failure of recognition. It was the condition of success. If you were doing it right, nobody knew your name. Bebbed. 3 weeks later, a package arrived at a medical facility address that existed on no publicly accessible record, containing a single item with no return address and no note. A coffee mug, institutional green, with a small scratch on the handle from where someone had set it down on a stone surface at a particular elevation. She recognized it. She held it in both hands for a moment, and then she put it on the desk in the room she was using for the network analysis, next to the 11 weeks of preparation files and the new configuration documents that were taking shape into something she couldn't name yet but was beginning to recognize. The way you recognize the early stages of a cover from the inside, not as a character you were putting on, but as a person who was slowly becoming real. The mug had come from Macon. She knew without needing confirmation that it had come from Macon because he was the kind of man who communicated in objects and actions rather than words when words weren't adequate. And a stolen institutional coffee mug was exactly the kind of message he would send. She set it next to her coffee. Then she opened the next analysis file and went back to work. Major Dennis Calloway was formally charged 6 weeks after his detention at FOB Black Mesa. The charges were documented, specific, and serious enough that no amount of institutional mitigation or legal strategy was going to produce a comfortable outcome. His cooperation with investigators had purchased a degree of procedural consideration, but nothing that approached leniency, because the people constructing the case were methodical and patient and not interested in leniency. 7 dead, 31 wounded, 2 years of operational compromise. The math was not forgiving. He was processed through the military justice system with the particular thoroughness that the system applied when the breach was sufficiently grave that the institution needed the accounting to be complete and visible, because the institution understood that its own integrity required it. Emma didn't attend any of it. She didn't need to. The accountability was happening, and it was real, and it was documented, and that was the thing that mattered, not her presence at it. She was, by the time the first charges were formally filed, already 1,200 miles away, working on a problem that required all of her attention, which was, she'd found, the best answer she knew for most things. Chad. The night before she deployed under the new configuration, 10 weeks of preparation, 12 if you counted the accountability process, compressed into a person who felt real enough to survive scrutiny. She sat with the green mug and the network analysis files and the new identity documents in a room that she would leave tomorrow and not return to. She thought about Voss, who had sent a formal commendation through channels that she would never officially see, but that Kellner had summarized for her in 2 sentences that she carried without writing down. She thought about Park, the duty officer, who had executed under pressure without full information and had gotten it right. She thought about Okafor, who was probably standing behind a serving counter somewhere right now, with a clipboard and the expression of a man perpetually let down by the world's indifference to efficient hot meal provision, and who had, in his way, been one of the best covers she'd ever had because he was so completely real. She thought about Macon. She hoped he was somewhere doing the thing he was obviously built for, which was being the person in a dangerous situation who looked at what was actually happening instead of what was supposed to be happening and acting on it. She'd met maybe a dozen people in her career with that particular quality, the capacity to trust their own read of a situation over the institutional narrative when those two things diverged. It was rarer than marksmanship, rarer than tactical training, rarer than almost anything. She finished the coffee and rinsed the mug and put it in her bag because she'd decided it was coming with her. Then she lay down and closed her eyes. and went to sleep in the particular way she'd learned to sleep over 11 years, quickly, completely, without ceremony, because tomorrow was a different problem than today, and the only thing that served tomorrow was being rested enough to meet it clearly. Outside the building, the world continued. Inside it, a woman who had no public name and no visible history and no record that any ordinary person would ever find made herself small and still and let the dark take her, the way she always had, in the space between one impossible thing and the next. 7 months later, in a city that was not Black Mesa and not anywhere connected to it on any map that mattered, a 2-year intelligence network with roots in 4 countries and consequences in more than that was dismantled in a sequence of coordinated actions that took 11 days and produced no press release and no official acknowledgement and no names attached to any account of how it had happened. The people who needed to know knew. The people who didn't went about their lives in the comfortable ignorance that someone had quietly chosen to maintain for them. That was the job. That had always been the job. The greatest weight a person can carry is not a weapon or a secret. It's the knowledge that the world you protect will never know your name, and choosing to carry it anyway, every single day, because the protection matters more than the recognition. The quiet ones always have.